If you're driven by an adventurous heart, you're in luck. The 2021 Subaru Outback shares your spirit. With standard symmetrical all-wheel drive plus up to 33 miles per gallon. An available 260 horsepower turbocharged engine, advanced technology, and an available extra-large touchscreen. The best Outback ever. The 2021 Subaru Outback. Go where love takes you.
Please.
Cold waters, deadly waters. According to the U.S. Coast Guard statistics, in 2020 there was a 23% increase in paddling fatalities. Water temperature is a key contributing factor to drowning, and yet many paddlers do not consider water temperature and the associated risks. This presentation will provide insight into the science of cold water and risk management, as well as rescue and recovery. Most importantly, it empowers the learner with the information they need to be safe paddling on cold water. Greetings, my name is Johnathan Albrand, and I'm with the United States Coast Guard Auxiliary. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary is the uniformed component of the United States Coast Guard. We partner and support the Coast Guard in all missions except military and law enforcement actions. We conduct safety patrols on the waterways, assist the Coast Guard with homeland security duties, teach boating safety classes, and conduct free vessel safety checks for the public. I'd like to thank you for joining this session, which I hope will be informative and provide you with insight into paddling safety. We have a very simple agenda. Today, we're going to talk about cold water and certain risks posed to paddlers. We will review some statistics, look at a couple of paddling tragedies, and review some safety considerations to help reduce risk. This presentation is about building awareness regarding cold water safety. If you look at the news today, you'll find that there are a lot of incidents related to canoes and kayaks and stand-up paddleboards or paddlecraft. Well, why is this happening? First, it has never been easier to acquire a canoe or kayak. Kayaks are very inexpensive in today's market. As a matter of fact, you can go to Walmart, pick up some mulch, a six-pack of beer, and throw a kayak in the back of your truck, all for under $250. This accessibility to paddlecraft has provided some wonderful opportunities for people to enjoy the outdoors, but also place them unknowingly at risk. In fact, statistics show that in 2020 there was a 56% increase in the sales of paddlecraft and a 12% increase in motorboat sales. To be sure, the pandemic has resulted in a significant increase in boat and paddlecraft acquisition. Unfortunately, with the increase of sales, there has also been a significant increase in fatalities. Over the past decade, the year-over-year change in fatality rates fluctuated within a range of 5% increase or decrease. But between 2019 and 2020, we saw a 25.1% increase in boating fatalities, the largest increase of fatalities in more than 20 years of Coast Guard recreational boating statistics. So what does a typical boating fatality look like? Well, life jackets are on board but not in use. The vessel is small, open boat. About 1/3 of the time, alcohol is involved, and it usually happens in daylight and good weather on a calm inland lake, and the operator is usually a male aged 26 to 50 with boating experiences. 75% of accidents are due to human error, and most are preventable. According to U.S. Coast Guard statistics, of the top 5 vessel types, paddlecraft are ranked as the number 2 vessel type for fatalities on the water. And where cause of death was known, 79% of fatal boating accident victims drowned. Of those drowning victims, with reported life jacket usage, 86% were not wearing a life jacket. The paddlecraft subset reflects the overall statistics, but also gives you insight into the individual paddlecraft types. While alcohol is the number 1 contributing factor of all boating fatalities, for the subset of paddlecraft, hazardous waters is the leading factor in 49% of all paddlecraft fatalities. Coming in second is operator inexperience, and at 16% alcohol. Apparently paddlers are a little too busy paddling perhaps to consume too much alcohol. That being said, of the top 3 contributing factors, the deadly combination of operator inexperience coupled with hazardous waters represents 85% of all paddlecraft fatalities. So what do we mean by hazardous waters? Well, the most common definition for hazardous waters as it relates to boating and paddling is cold water and moving water, such as rivers and streams, but also includes water in proximity with man-made structures such as piers and dams. As I mentioned earlier, one of the most common contributing factors to casualties on the water is operator inexperience. So today I'd like to highlight a recent tragic incident from which we can learn. Hazardous waters, cold and moving waters, this story saddens my soul, and yet it is indicative of how vulnerable people can be without realizing the true dangers of cold water. If you've not read this news story, you certainly should. To summarize, it was a beautiful day in the Apostle Islands. The family was paddling their 13.5-foot open tandem kayak from Madeline Island to Michigan Island, 3.5 miles away, when around 3 p.m. it was hit with a wave and capsized. And they could not recover from the capsize. So the father decided to swim with the youngest to the nearest island. Hours later, Eric Fryman and his 3 children, ages 9, 5, and 3, were found dead in the frigid waters. Only his wife, the children's mother, Carrie, survived. She was rescued around 9 p.m. She had stayed with the kayak and tried to call for help via her cell phone without success. Everyone was wearing a life jacket. The Coast Guard officials said that hypothermia was a major factor in the deaths, especially the children. So let's take a closer look at the risk factors associated with this incident, and later on we'll talk a little bit about how we might have prevented this or what things could have happened to reduce the risk. To understand what happened in this tragic incident, we need to take a deeper look into how cold water can impact our bodies and our ability to survive. One of the key factors in this tragedy was, of course, cold water. And in fact, here in Michigan, cold water is a constant reality for anybody who is paddling, boating, sailing at almost any time of the year. For your consideration, it is impossible to become hypothermic in cold water unless you're wearing flotation. Because without flotation, you won't live long enough to become hypothermic. Cold water is defined as being any water temperature under 70 degrees. While that sounds warm, it is a temperature that can facilitate a drop in body temperature through long-term exposure. Without a life jacket in cold water, you can only survive for about 10 minutes. But with a life jacket, you can survive for over an hour before hypothermia sets in. And keep in mind that many victims drown just feet from safety. And definitely it's important to remember that being a good swimmer has nothing to do with surviving. Even good swimmers drowned. It's not about swimming, it's about surviving. Let's first review a bit of physiology. When exposed to cold, your body goes to work trying to maintain a core temperature within its normal range. And it does this through multiple mechanisms. In your brain, the hypothalamus begins to work as a thermostat to initialize a process to regulate your temperature. And it initiates 2 key responses to exposure to cold. The first is vasomotion, and this is basically the change in the diameter of your blood vessels, either through vasoconstriction or vasodilation, primarily in your extremities, to control the heating and cooling of your body, working a lot like a radiator, if you will. The second key response is shivering thermogenisis, the body's natural impulse to generate heat. So shivering is actually a good thing. It executes to prevent hypothermia and or slow the onset of hypothermia and power the rewarming of the body. Shivering is an extremely effective means of creating body heat. At rest, we normally generate about 100 watts of heat. But when vigorous shivering occurs in the early stages of cold exposure and mild hypothermia, it can actually increase heat production up to 500 watts. When these mechanisms no longer maintain body core temperature, then your body core temperature begins to drop and you start trending towards hypothermia. Now that we understand what our body can do to stay warm, let's consider the impact of cold water immersion. There are 4 phases of cold water immersion. Phase 1 is cold shock. This is the initial gasp that literally takes your breath away, and you might even ingest water. It can lead to hyperventilation and cause fainting and even cardiac arrest for those with heart problems. So if you survive phase 1, then you move to phase 2, which is cold incapacitation. In this phase, there is a local cooling of the nerves and muscle fibers. You lose your ability to hold on to your boat, you experience swim failure, and you cannot perform survival tasks such as pulling yourself out of the water or trying to call for assistance. And if you can't get out of the water within 5 to 15 minutes, you may not be able to get out at all. Phase 3 is hypothermia. At this point, your body cannot create enough internal heat to overcome the cooling of your core temperature. As you continue to cool, you will further lose your ability to think clearly and may even slip into unconsciousness. If your head goes under, you will eventually drown within 30 to 120 minutes. And if you are wearing a life jacket, then you will basically cool until cardiac arrest and die within 90 to 180 minutes. The 4th phase is called circumrescue collapse. And this phase can occur just before, during, or right after rescue. And it can range from fainting, where is a drop in your blood pressure, to death via cardiac arrest. In simple terms, the causes center around the body's lack of ability to maintain proper heart function, blood pressure, and core temperature under the stressful conditions of cold water immersion and/or the demanding physical requirements of the rescue itself. This condition was well documented in World War II when it was found that safe recovery of downed pilots and sailors was certainly greatly enhanced when the rescued person was horizontal instead of pulled vertically from the water, and thereby relieving some of the stress and the strain on the heart. The 1-10-1 principle. To help you survive, it is important to understand the 1-10-1 principle. When you are immersed in cold water, your body is shocked and may initiate a gasp reflex. So you have about 1 minute to gain control over your breathing. After that, you may have 10 minutes of meaningful movement to perpetuate self-rescue before short-term cold incapacitation starts to set in, and that begins to diminish your ability for self-rescue. Lastly, you may have 1 hour before hypothermia kicks in and you start losing consciousness. Note, it's important to keep in mind that a life jacket can significantly increase your chance of survival. Cold water survival and prevention. Survival depends on keeping your head above the water, controlling your breathing, having timely rescue by yourself or others, and retaining your body heat. So when boating, paddling in cold water conditions, always wear a secured life jacket, wear layered clothing and not cotton, use modern technology or even a wetsuit or a dry suit, and equip your boat with a means of reentry, figuring out that if you do capsize, how do you get back to get into a safe position on top or within your kayak or canoe. And always keep in mind that you're dressing for immersion. You're not dressing for the air temperature. Another helpful survival technique is to use the H.E.L.P or heat escape lessening posture or Huddle techniques with others. Keep in mind that a sphere is the most efficient shape for retaining body heat. By making yourself more spherical, you can retain your body heat longer, and certainly in a group you can collectively use each other's body heat to stay warm. There's a good reason why sea mammals like seals and walruses are kind of chubby, and you certainly don't find snakes in Antarctica because it's all about the retention of heat. While this should not be a form of encouragement for a less than healthy lifestyle, overweight people do have the potential to survive significantly longer than lean athletic people. This, of course, is due to the more spherical shape. However, there may be other risks for heart failure and so forth. And of course, the warmer the water, the longer the survival time for everybody. Providing assistance. Rescue, recover, and rewarm. So let's consider how to provide assistance to victims. So there are three main priorities: rescue, to arrest the fall in core temperature; recover, to maintain that cardiovascular stability; and to rewarm, to establish a safe, steady warming of the victim. And keep in mind, trained or not, you may be the first responder. The sad reality of hypothermia is that a large percentage of severely hypothermic victims die during or shortly after the rescue. Many of these deaths can be attributed to improper rescue and handling techniques. In general, previously healthy persons should not die from a cold water immersion or hypothermic incident if they have been rescued, recovered, and rewarmed appropriately and in a proper and timely manner. It is important to get the victim out of the water. Getting out of the water as quickly as possible is the first step to preventing hypothermia. If conscious, encourage the victim to keep working to assist their own rescue and recovery and rewarming process. We want to protect them from the environment, make sure that they're a warm, protected area to begin that recovery process, and keep them horizontal to prevent blood from pooling in their legs and causing a dangerous drop in blood pressure. So what if you're the victim? This may mean reboarding your kayak or canoe or getting to shore if it's near. Should you swim for shore? Let's often get that question. Generally, you should always stay with a capsized boat if the chance of rescue is high. If you do not have a life jacket, then there is no choice but to stay with the boat. That is your only form of flotation. To be sure, there are other factors related to rescue, such as currents and the distance to shore, that can help make that a risky decision of whether you should swim or not. But if you do swim, and you're wrong, without a life jacket, the price is death. And with a life jacket, the price is simply incapacitation, but at least you're still floating. Once we've rescued an individual, we need to begin the recovery process. And to do that, we first have to identify the level of hypothermia. Mild, the individual is conscious and shivering, alert, speaking. So you can comfort them and keep them engaged in their recovery process. Shivering, as we said earlier, is a great thing. The body is generating its own heat. Moderate hypothermia, the person is conscious but not responsive. Again, comfort them, keep them engaged in the recovery. But because they're not shivering, that means they are very cold and the body is not engaged in thermogenesis. And third, in severe hypothermia, they can either be semi-conscious or unconscious and unresponsive, cold to touch. So you need to check for a pulse and breathing. Once you have determined the level of hypothermia, then you need to take appropriate action. Keep in mind the victim's body is very fragile in this cold condition. You also need to focus on warming the chest and torso. And also keep the body horizontal, because in this position it makes it easier for the heart to pump blood through the body. For mild hypothermia, warm, not hot, sugary fluids like warm chocolate can be helpful if the person is able to drink. With all hypothermia, seek medical attention immediately. If you are engaged in an extended trip or in a remote area, this can certainly be problematic. If transportation to the hospital will take more than 30 minutes, then repackaging the victim and rewarming them should be considered. Repackaging involves getting them wrapped in dry clothes, blankets, and even plastic sheeting to prevent further heat loss. Caution: victims that have been in cold water require different CPR techniques. It is of the utmost importance to take your time when checking for heart and respiration so that you are sure there is no heartbeat before starting CPR. Chest compressions will fibrillate a cold functioning heart. The victim's pulse may be slow and hard to find because of being cold. So keep in mind that CPR is not a temporal emergency, or in other words, it took some time for the victim to become hypothermic, and delaying CPR for a few minutes until you are absolutely sure they do not have a pulse will not compromise the victim. But rushing to start CPR may be fatal if the victim is not already in full arrest. Common sense risk management. Before you embark on a paddling adventure, it is important to evaluate any potential risks. To be sure, a 2-hour paddle around a small lake on a sunny summer afternoon has a relatively low risk factor, and yet there's no reason to not give consideration as to what could go wrong. Let's revisit the tragedy on Lake Superior and look at the risk factors. Sadly, the deck was stacked against them. We can analyze all of the errors, but any combination of these errors can be fatal. Cold water, dressed for the air temperature, not the water temps, deciding to swim rather than stay with the boat, the wrong type of kayak, overloading, moving water, changing weather conditions. Of all these factors, the most dominant factor was the water temperature that led to hypothermia and drowning. Even with life jackets, unconsciousness from hypothermia can potentially allow the bodies to turn face down in the water if the life jacket isn't designed to keep you face up. The type of life jacket that you have could be a very important consideration on your paddling journey. These tragic fatalities can provide a frame of reference for common sense planning. In most situations, risk can be managed if we use a bit of common sense and look at ways to mitigate our risk factors. We need to identify all of the elements that might impact the level of risk and look at ways of reducing that risk by making changes in our plans. Granted, sometimes we just don't go because the risk factors are too high. The United States Coast Guard utilizes several risk assessment tools to help identify, evaluate, and mitigate risk. One of the most common risk assessment tools is the GAR model, or green, amber, red. This methodology allows us to evaluate certain elements of any given situation and balance the risk factors. When you apply these elements to your outing, you can identify and reduce risk. Supervision. Is the trip leader experienced? Planning. Has the trip been thoroughly planned out? Team selection. What is the experience and level of the participants? Who is the least experienced of the group? Team fitness. Are the team members in appropriate health for such a trip? Environment and equipment. What is the weather? Do you have the right equipment for the journey? Do you know the waters and the associated hazards? And event complexity. How complex is the event? What are the potential complications? By rating each of these elements on a scale of 1 to 10, you can calculate a potential risk factor. An afternoon float down the Red Cedar River will usually have a fairly low risk factor, and much lower than, let's say, a 12-hour journey down the Au River. However, it is possible that the assessed risk factors could reverse that score. For example, the Red Cedar River during spring flood stage with inexperienced paddlers and the wrong equipment could certainly be disastrous. Let's talk about equipment for a minute. Wetsuits and dry suits. New materials have come a long way. Wetsuits and dry suits are a great way to reduce your risk when paddling in cold water, and they can extend the amount of time you can survive. However, they do not make you impervious or invincible to the effects of cold water, and they may also limit your mobility. Also keep in mind, like all safety equipment, your suit should be meticulously maintained, particularly with a dry suit, where a tear or leakage could compromise your protection and even make it difficult to be rescued. Having the right type of PFD or life jacket is also critical. When the water is cold, a full PFD is the right choice. It protects you and it keeps you warm. Inflatables, while convenient, are never a good choice when paddling in cold water. Also, they should never be used with a kayak. Accidental inflation could prevent you from exiting the kayak safely should you capsize. The belt variety is most often used with stand-up paddleboards, but would be nearly useless in a cold water incident. As we mentioned earlier, one thing that might have made a difference with the Lake Superior tragedy would have been to have had an appropriate communication device, like a marine radio. There are many benefits to a marine radio. They cost significantly less than a cell phone and are appropriate when navigating on open waters or in remote areas. The working range of a cell site, the range at which mobile devices can connect reliably to a cell site, is not a fixed figure, and it depends on several factors, including topography, tower height, and more. Marine radio channels, however, are monitored by other boaters and ships and the United States Coast Guard. Some radios can even provide GPS coordinates for the rescue teams. If you're traveling in remote places or in open water, a personal locator beacon is worth the price. You can be located literally anywhere in the world. These devices are simple to use. They emit a signal that rescuers can cue in on when responding to an emergency, and it works pretty much anywhere. A powerful strobe should also be part of your safety equipment. File a float plan. When you're planning a paddling trip, another very useful tool is a float plan. This plan can be informal, but should inform someone of who is going, what boats are going, where you are going, and when you are departing, and when you expect to return. The Coast Guard app provides you with a method of filing a formal float plan for extended or complex journeys. Prevention is your best defense. Be sure to have the proper equipment to include life jackets, proper clothing, and dress for immersion and visibility, a communications device like a radio or a cell phone, some signal service like a personal locator beacon, signal mirror, light, and whistle. Also engage in proper planning. Anticipate the weather. File a float plan. Do a risk analysis. And have an emergency plan for your craft and for your event. Lastly, use common sense. Know your limits, and remember, you may not anticipate an emergency, but you may have to respond to one. Lastly, there are two important things you can do to ensure your safety on the water. Number one, take a safe boating course. Make it a family event. If you've already taken one, take it again as a refresher. Number two, have your vessel safety check every year. It's free. It could save your life. And yes, the Coast Guard Auxiliary does inspect paddlecraft. If you are interested in taking a deeper dive into cold water safety, much of the research referenced in this presentation is courtesy of the Cold Water Bootcamp Project, and you can learn more at the URLs listed here. Thank you for your time and interest today as we discussed cold water safety. On behalf of the United States Coast Guard Auxiliary and the U.S. Coast Guard, thank you for your interest, and we look forward to seeing you out on the water safely.